Hello, I'm Gary Koop, and welcome everyone to this third plenary session. We're very pleased to have today Catherine Abraham. Catherine Abraham is Professor of Economics and Survey Methodology at the University of Maryland. I know her as a labor economist. She's a top academic who's done a lot of very well cited work in labor economics, including lots of work on retirement decisions, measuring economic activity. And she's recently been doing a lot of stuff on very topical work, such as measuring the gig economy, which is, I think, very interesting for many people here. But the thing which makes her an extra good keynote speaker is that she has such extensive experience with government, which I think should make her ideal for this ESCoE conference. She's formerly served as the Commissioner of the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. She's been a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and most recently, she's chaired the US Commission on Evidence-Based Policymakers. And so I'm very happy to welcome her talk today on a topic of great interest to many of us called Big Data in the 21st Century Big Data for 21st Century Economic Statistics. Now, just as the other keynotes, she will talk for about 45 minutes, so we'll have some time for discussion. And a reminder to please type questions in the chat box, and I will moderate some at the end of her talk. Now, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'm really happy to have the chance to talk with all of you about this topic. Let me just get my slideshow up here. For some reason, there it is. Okay, great. So my interest in this topic grows out of a lot of discussions that people in the statistical agencies here in the United States have been having, research that academic folks are doing. A couple of years ago, I was a co-organizer for a conference with this title. So I've been thinking a lot about how new types of data are likely to transform the functioning of national statistical offices. My perspective is coming at this from the United States, but I hope that some of what I'll have to talk about will resonate with people from elsewhere. So just by way of background, the infrastructure, the methods used for producing US economic statistics were really developed quite a long time ago now, in the years following World War II. So for decades, most of our economic data have come from surveys based on probability samples that have produced reliable estimates at surely lower costs than doing censuses. If you look at our statistics on employment, unemployment, earnings, labor turnover, I could go on and on, they mainly come from surveys of households, surveys of businesses. This model has two big advantages in terms of producing official statistics. One is that survey samples can be designed to represent the population of interest, and the other is that if you're doing a survey, you can design questionnaires that ask about exactly the things that you want to know about. Censuses, periodic censuses, administrative data are used to benchmark these survey estimates, but most of the information is coming from surveys done by the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Bureau of Economic Analysis is mainly a user of those survey data. The problem is that model, which has served us so well for so long, is subject to growing pressures, pressures that I assume you are aware of. One is the increasing difficulty of obtaining survey responses. That's something that's been brewing for a while, but it has really gotten a lot worse in the last 10 years. What this graph is showing you is the unit response rate to a handful of some of the major US household surveys, and you can see response rates have been trending down for a long time. But if you look at what's happened in just the last 10 years, between 2009 and 2019, the response rate to our Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement, which is where we get all our household survey income data, as an example, has fallen by nearly 20%. And some of the other surveys have been equally hard hit. You see the same thing showing up in response rates to business surveys. These again are response rates to selected business surveys done by the US Census Bureau. Two key surveys are the Annual Survey of Manufacturers and the Annual Retail Trade Survey. And again, response rates to those two surveys have fallen by round numbers 20% in the 10 years from 2009 to 2019. So that's a big issue for the sustainability of our existing model. A second pressure on that model is the increasing demand for more timely data. Statistical agencies can always move up their publication dates, but if they do that, they won't have as much information to base their estimates on, and users of data want not just data that's timely, but data that isn't going to be subject to a lot of subsequent revision. The third pressure on this model is the increasing demand for more disaggregated data. A few years ago, I served on a panel I had chaired a panel that was convened by our Committee on National Statistics at our National Academies of Sciences. And we were charged with looking at the annual economic surveys done by the US Census Bureau. And as part of that, we had a workshop where we brought in users of the data. And I was really a little bit surprised about the emphasis that they placed on wanting data that were really disaggregated. They didn't want just state level data. They didn't even want just metropolitan area data. They wanted data down to the county level that were broken out in some detail by industry, which is not something that the statistics produced by the Census Bureau, the BLS, the BEA typically provide. So that's a pressure on the existing model in terms of meeting users' demand for information. And then a final pressure on this model is that collecting survey data is increasingly expensive given the growing reluctance of survey respondents, but agency budgets haven't been keeping up, at least in the United States. What this chart shows is the trend in real budgets for the three major economic statistics agencies. The two big ones are the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau. It's a little hard to figure out how to look at the budget for the Census Bureau because the economic censuses and decennial censuses cause big ramp ups and ramp downs. So for this purpose, I've left those out. And you can see that real budgets for these agencies have been falling. The BEA has done a little bit better, but they're a small part of the total. So given all of these pressures on the current model, there has naturally been interest in other ways to produce the statistics that users of the agency's data want. And that brings us to thinking about big data. Big data, natively digital data have really proliferated in recent years. The US agencies have considerable experience with using administrative data, but the new frontier, I think, is whether big data from private sources can be used to address some of the challenges that the agencies are facing. The hope is that using these new types of data might help to reduce respondent burden, might help to increase the timeliness or reduce the revisions in published data. They might allow the agencies to publish more granular data that are more disaggregated by industry or geography. I think the Congress hopes that if the agencies start using more of these types of data, it might save money. I'm rather less optimistic about that, but that's out there too. So what kinds of data am I talking about? I'm talking about a whole variety of sources of data. Scanner data from retail outlets, information that's scrapable or obtainable through APIs on the web, credit card transaction data, We have some big payroll processing firms that have data on the payrolls and hours worked for a lot of companies. There's companies that provide scheduling software to businesses. Their databases contain useful information. And then of course there's sensor data and GPS tracking data. So there's a lot of different types of data out there that could potentially be useful. I think as the US statistical agencies have started thinking about using these types of data, there's a number of things they've needed to consider. So I have a couple of slides here that sort of try to draw contrasts between what you get with survey data and what you get with some of these types of naturally occurring data. So just to go through these. Survey data generally give you small samples, but their advantage is that you know if they're designed well, that those samples are representative of the population that you're interested in. Naturally occurring data, on the other hand, give you very large, but not necessarily representative samples. Survey data can be designed to collect exactly the information that you care about. So the data elements are designed to meet your statistical needs. With naturally occurring data, on the other hand, the data elements reflect the needs and the constraints of the business processes that are generating the data. At least in principle, quality control is really central to the process of doing surveys, though obviously errors can and do arise. When you're thinking about these naturally occurring types of data elements that are really relevant to the business and its processes are quite likely to be accurate. Other data elements may be less so. A significant issue for national statisticians is that if you're relying on surveys to generate your data, you have control over those data being comparable over time. Whereas if you're using naturally occurring data, the comparability of the data can be disrupted if business requirements change. With survey data, the data records are designed for statistical analysis. With naturally occurring data, that's not the case. And a significant issue can be that the data aren't necessarily well documented. It may be hard even to figure out exactly what you have. Just to give one illustration of that, I've been working with some colleagues in our College of Engineering at the University of Maryland on a study using mobile phone data. We have all these data records from phones and where they're located at different points in time, but we really don't have any idea exactly how those records were generated. We don't know, for example, what apps people had turned on that generated their position information. So things we would like to know in order to be able to use the data in the best possible way. When you think about survey data, those data are owned by the statistical agency. If you are thinking about using naturally occurring data, those data are not owned by the statistical agency. They're owned by the business that generated the data. And that raises a host of issues. In many cases, data aggregators that are holding data that might be of interest have assembled the data as an asset, and they are interested in selling the data in order to generate a profit. So it can actually be quite expensive to obtain these data. One of the kinds of naturally occurring data that have been discussed for a long time as a possible source of information that could be used for measuring changes in prices and so on are scanner data from retail establishments. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has looked at various points in time at whether those data could replace sending data collectors out to stores to collect prices. And at least up until this point, the conclusion has been that, especially given that the coverage of the scanner data is incomplete, so you would still need to supplement the scanner data with some kind of in-person survey data collection. given the price that the holders of the data wanted to charge, it was just not cost effective. There's another issue that I should flag, which is there is concern on the part of the statistical offices about becoming too dependent on one provider of data who, once the data got integrated into the production of official statistics, would be in a monopoly position, and that could be problematic in a variety of ways. So that's another thing to think about. And then finally, just a last thing to mention in terms of considerations with regard to incorporating naturally occurring data into official statistics is that the agency's physical and human infrastructure really have been developed for the collection and processing of survey data to the extent that we're moving in the direction of making more use of some of these private sources of big data, enhancements to the computing capacity, the addition of staff with a somewhat different skill set or training for the current staff would be an important part of making this work. So trying to sum up what this implies about criteria for deciding when it makes sense to adopt big data for gold standard official statistics, some of those criteria that the agencies here have been applying are they're looking at whether it's become more difficult to collect data using current methods. They're looking at whether the data are actually a good fit for incorporation into production of a particular set of statistics. They're looking at whether the quality of the estimates that will result are of similar or better quality. They're looking at costs, either at whether the costs are going to be lower or whether the added costs can be justified based on improvements in the estimates. And then they're thinking as well about this risk of relying on third-party data suppliers. So just to give you some examples of the kinds of interesting things that the agencies are doing, this is just a selected set of examples of ways in which the US statistical agencies are beginning to use big data in the production of official statistics. I'll start with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has a whole program of trying to incorporate big data to improve the consumer price index. Here in the US, the consumer price index data, the price data that underlie the index, are collected by field economists who go out and survey businesses and also survey rental units. They collect mostly in person about 94,000 prices of commodities and services every month, and then also collect rents for about 8,000 rental units. This is very expensive. And there is a program underway to try to substitute data from alternative sources. My understanding is that there is a similar program underway at ONS and also at Statistics Canada. And if we have time in the Q&A, I'd be interested to hear comments about that, the ONS program. But in terms of what's going on in the, oh dear, sorry. With respect to the US effort, there's a set of prices that the Bureau of Labor Statistics for a long time has gotten from alternative sources. So they buy data from a company called JD Power to track the prices of used cars. They get information on postage prices from a publicly available source. But they've also started pulling in other types of data. There are a couple of companies that said to the BLS, we don't want you sending your data collectors to our stores. We'd rather just send you all of our data and keep you out of our hair. So they've incorporated those data sent directly in electronic form from the company's records. There's an app that collects information on gas prices. And the BLS has determined that they can use those data instead of sending people out to gas stations to price motor fuel. There's a couple other examples of things that are already in the process of being implemented, but they're looking at greatly expanding the use of alternative sources of data. looking at insurance records as a source of information on medical prices, scraping data from the web on prices for phone service, and so on and so on. You can see the examples here. If they're successful with all of this, something over a fifth of the prices used in producing the CPI, or the prices used that account for a fifth of the weight of the index, will be based on alternative data sources rather than on survey data. The BEA is interested in finding ways to use big data to improve their estimates. The BEA pulls in information from a variety of sources to produce the gross domestic product report. Some of those data lag the publication of the GDP data. So a big part of GDP is expenditures for services. The main source of data for spending on services is the census's quarterly services survey. Those data aren't available at the time that the BEA publishes the first estimate of GDP. And in that case, what the BEA does is essentially to extrapolate from past data. A consequence of that, though, is that the data are often significantly revised at later releases when these data become available. What the BEA researchers have been looking into is whether there's a way to use big data to do a better job of nowcasting what the quarterly services survey data are going to say. The research team looking at this tested literally hundreds of thousands of different models based on different machine learning algorithms, different ways of selecting the input variables to these algorithms, and different source data that would be available at the time of the first release of GDP that could be used to help predict what the quarterly services survey data are going to look like. That included data from credit card transactions, so a non-traditional source of data. The goal is to reduce the revisions between the first estimate and the estimate, the second and third estimates. What the research showed was that using ensemble machine learning methods, data on employment, data on credit card transactions, significantly helped to improve the predictions of spending in many of the 188 industries that the quarterly services survey produces data for. Their estimate was that using those predictions could reduce the size of the revisions to personal consumption expenditure by on the order of 12%. They've now incorporated this into production of GDP, the first estimate of GDP. The Census Bureau is doing a lot in this area. One area where they've been doing interesting things is with looking at the production of monthly data on retail sales. Those data are collected from a survey sample of about 13,000 businesses. The survey is a company level survey, so there isn't any geographic data available from the survey. The Census Bureau has been looking at using point of sale data from third-party vendors to reduce the burden on some of their big respondents and improve national estimates. This point of sale company has data for individual companies, and the Census Bureau is asking for permission to get the data directly from this third-party vendor rather than from the company. But the really interesting thing that they've done is to also use these data to begin producing more disaggregated retail sales estimates. They've begun publishing a monthly state level set of estimates of retail sales for all retail and for some selected sectors. It always would have been possible to take the national data and allocate it out based on some indicator variable like payroll. But you know that if you do that, that sales don't necessarily correlate with payroll. The pattern, the seasonal patterns of sales may be different across areas. So you know that's going to be an imperfect estimator. What they've done is to incorporate this point of sale data, which is available geographically disaggregated, to produce a bottom-up estimate of retail sales by state, and then compositing these two estimates come up with this new series that they're publishing on retail sales by state. Census is also doing some super interesting things with using big data in producing construction statistics. One thing they're doing is replacing a survey that they've done for a long time, where they survey local office permit granting offices to find out about permits that have been issued for new residential construction. They, at the beginning of next year, will be replacing that completely with third-party data from a couple of companies that collect this sort of thing already. The Construction Monitor and CoreLogic are the companies, and then scraping information for the remaining jurisdictions from the web. So that's pretty interesting. The thing that's really cool that they're doing is using big data to replace some of the information they collect on residential building starts and completions, and also on the characteristics of new residential construction. Currently, that information comes from a survey, the Survey of Construction. What they're looking at doing is substituting information based on satellite images for a lot of the what's currently collected in the survey. Just to give you an idea of what they're looking at. So you have information on these building permits, so you know where new construction is supposed to be occurring. With satellite images, you can focus in on those locations. You can see what the location looked like before the construction started. You can see what happens when the construction begins, and then you can infer from the images when the construction has been completed. There's a lot of work that goes on, and that has to go on in terms of analyzing these images and drawing appropriate conclusions from them. But the hope is to largely replace the information that's currently collected through the Survey of Construction with information from these satellite images. There is some information that can't be collected through the satellite images, and that will still be collected by sending data collectors out. But the fact that there's so much less need for that will let them collect information for a larger sample, and hopefully be able to publish data that are more geographically disaggregated and have more detail in general. So these examples cover a variety of uses for big data in the production of sort of gold standard official statistics, from substituting for selected survey observations, as in the CPI example, or improving early estimates, as in the BEA example, or producing more disaggregated estimates, as in the census retail sales by state example, or even replacing survey data entirely. So I just think it's really exciting what the agencies are beginning to do. All of this was going on before the start of the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, accelerated interest in non-traditional data as a result of the intense demand that a desire to understand what was going on created for real-time data, as well as the intense demand that state and local officials had for wanting information that was more local. So what's happened in the United States is that there has been just a tsunami of academic research on trying to understand the impact of the crisis that has made use of many of these types of non-traditional data. I'm going to give you just a few examples. There are many more that I could cite. One type of data that people turned to was data on, was mobile phone data. This study that I'm citing is one carried out by the group I'm working with in our College of Engineering. Looking at mobile phone data, what they found was that early on, there was, so what they've done is to construct, based on the mobile phone observations, an index of social distancing by looking at these phone locations. And you can see that on the left of this chart are values for this social distancing index, or day by day, and you can see it's less during the week and more on the weekend, but at a fairly steady level. And then you can see that vertical dotted line is the start of the COVID period. And you can see that people began to social distance more. That's the dark blue line. But you can also see what the range of that index is across locations. And you can see that the increase in social distancing was very uneven across areas. And they could lay out where it was higher and where it was lower. So that was interesting information. Another type of data that people turned to was data from payroll processing firms. There was a group of researchers at the Federal Reserve Board that had started working with these data from ADP before the onset of the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, they were well equipped to use those data to try to dig in on what was happening. They found some really interesting things. One thing they found was on the left that the impact on employment with the onset of the pandemic was much bigger for small firms than it was for larger firms, though they subsequently recovered in relative terms. The other thing that was very striking was the results that they generated by wage level. They found that the people whose employment was most affected with the onset of the pandemic were the lowest paid people. And then in fact, for relatively high wage people, the impact was modest. A third type of data that people turned to was credit card data. There's a group at JP Morgan Chase who've been doing a lot of work with anonymized records for their banking customers. They have information on their credit card spending, their debit card spending, their checking account transactions. And so they could look to see when the pandemic hit, what happened to spending on the part of households with different income levels. It's a little counterintuitive, given what happened to employment, or what we think happened to employment based on the work that was done looking at the payroll processing data. You might have thought that it would be the low wage people whose spending would have been most affected because their employment was most affected. But in fact, that doesn't seem to be in these data what happened. Everybody's spending fell right at the onset of the pandemic, but then when the emergency assistance from the Treasury hit, spending on the part of the lowest income group rebounded to close to its original level. And then just one last example is the various studies that have been done using data from a company called Homebase. It's a pretty small company. It provides scheduling software to small businesses. The data from Homebase only covers something like 500,000 workers. So it's not a really big company. Though people who have looked at the data have made the argument that it's pretty representative. To be determined, I guess. One interesting thing that people have done with those data is to look at the effects of shutdown orders and then reopening orders on hours of work. and that's shown in the panel on the left. What the authors of the study I'm citing found was that the shutdown orders reduced employment by maybe 10%, or reduced hours by maybe 10%, but that hours recovered relatively quickly. How can we put that into context? We could put that into context by looking at just what the effects of time were as the shutdown hit, sort of independent of shutdown orders in various states and localities. How much did employment fall? And the conclusion they came to was that the effect of these shutdown orders per se was, although identifiable and significant, very modest compared to just the effects of the pandemic itself. So there's all of this interesting stuff that academic researchers have been doing with these big data. A lot of the headlines that you have seen in the newspapers in the United States talking about what's happened during the pandemic are based on these studies. So all of these headlines are talking about data that were generated not by the statistical agencies, but by academic researchers obtaining and analyzing some of these sources of private sector big data. That's not to say that the statistical agencies weren't active. They were, though they were largely active in more traditional kinds of ways. The Census Bureau was really proactive. It got out there and launched a new household survey and a new small business survey designed to try to find out how households and businesses were responding to the pandemic or dealing with the pandemic. And they had the first wave of those surveys out in the field in April of last year. The Bureau of Labor Statistics added questions to the current population survey. Those were on the survey in May. The BLS also has fielded a new business response survey that asks some different questions than the census surveys. But those are survey data. They're not using all of this big data. The BEA actually has started using big data to publish relevant information. The BEA has been using credit card transactions data to produce weekly estimates of retail spending. So there's been some use of big data. I think comparing the US to other national statistical offices, I think there are national statistical offices that have done more. And again, if we have time in the Q&A, I'd be really interested in hearing from folks at the ONS about things that are going on there. I know that Statistics Netherlands back in 2016 actually created a Center for Big Data Statistics, though I've not been able to find much trace of what they've been doing online. The ONS Data Science Campus, of course, was established in 2017. The Faster Indicators program at ONS, from my perspective, really has been doing during the pandemic a lot of the things that in the US academic researchers have taken on. So again, looking at information that some folks there were kind enough to send me. Some of the projects undertaken at the Data Science Campus have included publishing mobility reports that provide usable information to policymakers on people's travel to work, travel to retail establishments, and so on. Using Barclaycard data to produce information on what's happening to consumer spending. Downloading and analyzing the text of announcements on businesses' websites to learn about how they're responding to the pandemic, which is a super exciting project. So the response in the although the same information arguably is being generated, the way, as best I can tell, that has happened has been somewhat different in the US than in the UK. So this raises in my mind questions about what the role of a national statistics office really is. And I will say that for a long time, my view of national statistical offices, the right thing for the BLS, the BEA, the Census Bureau to be doing, was to focus on producing gold standard official statistics with well-documented properties that were published on a regular schedule, and that would be a point of reference for other people who were looking at other types of information. And I think if that's your view of what a National Statistics Office should be doing, the implication for that is that the uses of this private sector naturally occurring data may be more limited. It's incorporating these data into the existing structure for the production of official statistics in cases where it's better because it reduces respondent burden, or it's higher quality, or maybe it costs less. But I think there is a different vision of the role of a National Statistics Office that I'm coming around to, which is a more expansive vision. And I don't mean in any way to suggest that this portfolio of gold standard official statistics isn't important and doesn't need to be maintained. It is, and it does. But I think that there is an argument for national statistics offices also serving the role of providing credible information that can best inform current national, state, and local policy decisions, even above and beyond the standard portfolio of statistics. And in that view, I think there is a larger role for private naturally occurring data to address questions that official statistics just can't answer. And that's, really been brought home during the pandemic, but I think that it's more generally the case that there would be value in national statistics offices trying to do more with this. You might worry that going down this path undermines the credibility of the official statistics, because inherently some of this information based on private sources of big data are going to be less representative. They're going to be a little more speculative in that what you measure in the data may not be exactly the thing that you ideally would like to measure. But I think there's ways to differentiate the gold standard official statistics from these other more experimental measures. And I do worry, speaking from the perspective of the United States, that if our statistical agencies don't adapt to the demand for more timely information, more granular information, information on a changing set of things, that they run the risk of being perceived as less relevant. The statistical offices don't any longer have a monopoly on data provision. And if there are other providers of data who are giving policymakers and other decision makers the information they think they want, I think that's not a good thing for the statistical agencies. Reinventing themselves in the fashion that I'm contemplating will pose challenges. In the short run, it's not going to save money. The agencies would need appropriate resources in order to do this. It's going to need leaders who really believe in this vision and buy-in from the staff. In the US, this is a problem that's specific to us and not to many other countries. I think we probably need to think about reorganizing our statistical system. If you're trying to figure out the best way to use these naturally occurring big data to answer economic questions generally, it's not going to be helpful to have 3 separate economic statistics agencies that try to coordinate their activities, but aren't necessarily always pulling in the same direction or operating in a coordinated fashion. But I think these are challenges we can meet. So on the one hand, the threat to our current way of doing business is, something to, it's a concern, it's something to be worried about. But I think viewing this in a positive light, it's a really exciting time to be an economic statistician, and I look forward to seeing how far the agencies are able to get in the coming years. So let me stop. Those were the thoughts that I wanted to share with you. As I will stop sharing my.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk, very thought-provoking. And it's interesting to see both the progress made and the challenges still faced. I mean,
Yes.
you have two sets, at least two sets of people in the audience. You have practitioners from places like the ONS, as well as econometricians and nowcasters such as myself, who are very much interested in the econometric model building side. And it's really clear now, after seeing your talk, that these new data really have the potential to help both of us. I mean, often the devil is in the details, that you have some general idea that Google mobility trends might tell you something, or credit card sales might tell you something about retails. But it's hard to say exactly what. And it's really clear from your talk that a lot of people are getting to grips with the details there.
Yeah, and I should say, I in my overview, I really glossed over a lot of the details that people are having to wrestle with. I was more trying to illustrate the potential of these sorts of data than, you know, the nitty gritty of the hard work that goes into actually finding ways to use them effectively.
Yes, it was music to my ears to hear that the BEA is using machine learning algorithms and variable selection operators. I'm sure there's lots of interesting details there that must be challenging for them. I mean, the problem I've had basically often is that so many of these time series and these are so short.
Yes. Yeah, and that's one of the things that they were wrestling with, was exactly that. So you don't really, you ideally would have a long time series and you could build your models, and then you would have a good set of, you know, test data to see how it was working. And they've got a really short time period. So they're limited in what they can do. What they ended up doing was, you know, sort of basing their model selection, you know, not on series by series what the, you know, the test data were showing, but, you know, looking across the whole spectrum of industries and using that as a way to decide which seemed to be working and which didn't.
Okay, I guess I should remind everyone that Q&A is in the chat box, and I'd encourage all the ONS people in particular to take on Catherine's challenge. But I see there are a couple questions. Sarah, could you unmute? Camu has a question.
Yes.
Go ahead, Camu.
I'm a little bit concerned about the privacy issue about those satellite images they collected. Are those data shared by the police or CIA or FBI and things like that? Thank you.
Well, they certainly wouldn't be shared by the agency with any of those other agencies. The statistical, the confidentiality legislation that governs statistical agencies in the US would prohibit them from doing that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether those agencies have access to satellite images independently. They may well do, but they certainly wouldn't be coming through the statistical agency.
I see a question from Eric Bartelsman. Perhaps Sarah could unmute.
I just lost my ability to hear you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Really, Catherine, I think you were getting onto this already. But in the US, private companies are collecting data based upon two-sided transactions. They're becoming private data. And with these, they're really able to, I'd say, front-run economic developments. One of the public good aspects of statistical agency data is allow economies to function by providing information to all actors in the economy and equal access in a level playing field to be able to find out what's happening to inflation versus local prices. And now we're having firms really front running. Do you think the statistical agencies, maybe together with the competition authorities, should play a very strong role in creating public infrastructure to provide these data as near as real time as possible to create a level playing field to make the economy function better?
That's a really good question. I don't know that we can stop companies from compiling information and making it available to their customers, but you're absolutely right that one of the important arguments for national statistics offices is that they level the playing field. I mean, that goes back all the way to the beginning of the history of the U.S. National Statistical Service. I'm thinking about the National Agricultural Statistics Service and its origins in farmers feeling like when they brought their crops to market in the 1860s that they didn't know what market prices were, and that put them at a disadvantage relative to the people buying their crops. And that was sort of the impetus for beginning to produce information on crop prices. But I think that is an argument for the statistical agencies pushing in this direction to try to be more involved in generating more real-time information on things that are of current policy concern so that everyone has that information. I have to think more about your thought about whether we should be regulating this in some way. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah. Well, for privacy as well, the GDPR, at least for the EU countries, the GDPR allows individuals who are involved in a transaction to claim ownership back. Now, that doesn't help the open data access,
No,
but there's a coordination effort needed to allow all these individuals to pool their data to allow the statistical agency to use it. So there's a other step there that's missing.
Yeah, we don't have quite the same privacy regulations. So some of the things that would be more of an issue in Europe are less of an issue for us, though. This is something I didn't really talk about much. There are potential privacy concerns with some of this, though I think, again, with respect to what the statistical agencies are going to produce, they're going to be very cognizant of that.
I see Martin Wheel has a question. Perhaps Martin could be unmuted.
The worry I have based on experience of traditional macroeconomic modeling going back a long time is that almost as soon as you start relying on models, they tend to disintegrate. Do you think the risk of model instability used to interpret natural data is greater if you use models to interpret natural data rather than construct conventional data? And how best do you think that sort of risk can be managed, please?
So again, you're raising a really good point. And I think, we already in some sense have seen this in that some of the models that were, the agencies working on some of these big data projects had developed prior to the start of the pandemic really didn't work very well during the pandemic. So you're right that model instability is a potential issue. In part, I think that, to the extent that what we're not going to get away from judgment in some sense. If we're relying on modeling to produce some of the inputs to our gold standard official statistics, we need to have diagnostics in place that tell us when those models seem to be breaking down and the ability to respond accordingly. I guess I'm somewhat less concerned about this to the extent that what is being produced are more experimental statistics. As long as the agencies are clear about what the approach they're taking is and what the modeling strategy is and what its potential weaknesses are, I think users of the data can be brought to understand what those limitations are, and the data still are likely to be useful. But you do raise a very good point about model instability in changing economic environments.
Thank you.
I see there's a couple of questions on related issues involving, well, the incentives private companies have to share data, et cetera. So what I'll do is call on one, Alejandro Ruiz, to ask his question, which might answer some of the other questions as well. Alejandro? Alejandro, you're muted.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you so much. Yes, I just want to ask, how can we start to shed light on the incentives that private companies could have to share their data for the public use?
So that is another excellent question. The way that this has worked in the US has been mainly, the statistical agencies mainly have been using data compiled by data aggregators, and mainly they've been signing contracts where they're paying money for access to the data. So that's one incentive. If the companies can sell data to the agencies, there's an incentive for them to do that. But the agency's budgets are limited, and there's only so far they can go with that. One other idea that people here have talked about is creating an incentive for companies to share data by relieving them of the burden of responding to surveys. So if we could set up a mechanism where, for example, a payroll services provider could tell its customers, if you sign this form, if you buy our payroll processing services, we'll also take over reporting your data to the federal statistical agencies, so you don't have to do that anymore. So relieving businesses of reporting burden may be another incentive. Some of these companies, I think, feel like they get positive publicity and goodwill from sharing data. So this company that I mentioned, Homebase, which is this really small scheduling software company, they have gotten so much free publicity by sharing their data with academic researchers who are publishing these studies. And maybe there's some generalizability of that. If a company could say, well, yes, and we produce these data and they're so good that the US Census Bureau uses them in producing its whatever statistics. But I think this clearly needs more thought.
TR had a little bit more about the issue of private data. Could you unmute TR, please, whoever TR is?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Great presentation today, very interesting. I just had a quick question or two. I was wondering how the cost of using private data that you might have to pay for compared to using survey data. And if you do have to pay for the data, what are the implications of making it publicly available? Thank you.
So the cost trade-off varies depending on what you're talking about. So I think I may have mentioned that it's not always cost effective to buy the data. As I think I mentioned, that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has looked at using scanner data for replacing the direct collection of prices, but given the cost of doing so, it just wasn't cost effective. So it's not always going to be cost effective. When the agencies have decided it's cost effective, the contracts that they sign with the data provider give them the right to use the data in producing official statistics. So the raw data aren't going to be made publicly available, but the statistics based on the data are are made publicly available.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see we have, okay, one final question, if we may. Alfredo Bustos, if you could unmute it, but we are running short in time, Alfredo, so short question.
I'll try to be very, very short. I was wondering if you see any use of data contained in electronic accounting systems. They are daily maintained, millions of documents are being produced by day, and hardly anything is mentioned about them whenever big data is referred. Can you say something about this? I mean, respondent burden would be a point in favor of this, but could you say something more?
I'm sorry, I did not follow the question.
I'm sorry.
It was about electronic accounting systems and their usefulness.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, that's another thing that agencies are thinking about here, which is whether instead of sending a survey to a big business, they could just get the business to agree to download their records in some from the electronic accounting system. And there are cases where that's what companies are doing. The companies are saying, we don't want to fill out this complicated form. We'll just send you our data, you figure it out. Not every company is going to want to do that, of course, but there is some of that going on.
Thank you very much. I think our time has come. I'd like to thank Catherine again for an excellent and thought-provoking talk, and thank all of you who attend. I'll remind everyone we have a whole day tomorrow as well, and in the lobby there is a chat function where you can ask questions of anyone else at the conference, including, I'm sure, Catherine. But for now, let me end this session and look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thanks very much, Gary.